fall now, and I actually have some apple peels drying over here, so it smells like apples, which is such an amazing fall smell. And kind of the summer berries are gone, and some of the spring greens are like long gone. So the question is, what do we harvest in the fall? Before we dive into the video, I just want to remind everybody that this video is for educational purposes only. I'm not here to diagnose, treat, or cure any health conditions, and you always want to consult with a qualified healthcare provider or herbalist before using any plant medicinally, especially if you're pregnant, nursing, or taking medications. Foraging should be done responsibly, and proper plant identification is key to safety. Do your research and forage at your own risk. First, I want to start with some of the fruits that are uniquely available in the fall. A lot of berries ripen in the summertime, but there are a couple that persist into the fall and sometimes even in the winter. So let's talk about a couple of them. You definitely won't want to miss hawthorn berry, which is one of my favorites to harvest in the fall. We usually harvest hawthorn berry in October. In my area, like mid-October is great. One seed hawthorn is the most widespread hawthorn in North America, and it's a non-native tree that some would actually thank you for removing the berries from. You want to catch the berries when they are soft and bland. So when they're unripe, they might be like sour and astringent, and you can just taste it. It has a giant seed inside, so be careful.
One seed hawthorn leaves have little lobes, and the undersides are a little bit white. And the berries grow in clusters, and they actually have little star-shaped indentations on the bottom, kind of like an apple does, because they are actually related to apples. And we're going to harvest these little clusters and then pick the leaves out when we get home.
You can find a recipe for hawthorn chutney in my book if you're interested. And you can also make things like hawthorn cordial and hawthorn ketchup. The summary on the medicinal uses of hawthorn is that it's super high in antioxidants, which make it really good for strengthening the blood vessels and also strengthening and regulating the heartbeat as well. Another fruit that we can harvest in the fall is rose hips. And rose hips are certainly like an iconic thing to harvest. A lot of people, I think they're really beautiful, and they see them on the bush and they want to harvest them. And they actually do dry really well, even in clusters, if you wanted to put them in like flower arrangements. However, if you are picking them to eat or use medicinally, there are a couple things that you need to know before you do that. So the inside of rose hips, when you cut them open, contains seeds. And those seeds have irritating hairs inside of them. Those hairs were actually the original ingredients in itching powder, where you put it in somebody's clothes and it makes them itch. And it basically does that to your insides. So we're talking throat, intestines, stomach, all the things between here and there, basically. So it can cause extreme irritation in the GI tract if you prepare this plant incorrectly. So you just want to make sure that you are digging out the seeds, and you can also soak them in cold water, and some of the hairs will float to the top. And if you're making jelly or tea or stuff like that, you'll just want to make sure that you strain it really well to get the hairs out. Rose hips are also used medicinally. They have a lot of vitamin C and a lot of bioflavonoids, so they're also used to support blood vessel health and also immunity. There are actually a lot of different species of roses to choose from when you're harvesting your rose hips. I think the worst rose hips actually come from just regular old cultivated cut roses that people have in their gardens. I would say though, my favorite hip is hands down Rosa rugosa if you're making something that is edible like jam or jelly. All right, this last thing I want to talk about may not seem like a fruit, but technically seeds are, botanically speaking, fruits. So this is dock seed. Dock seed is a wild edible that I just got into this year, and I actually really love them. It's one of the few wild edible seeds that grows where I live, and it's pretty well distributed throughout the United States, so probably some species of dock, which is the Rumex genus, grows near you. You eat both the seed and the husk, which some people think is kind of weird, but that seems to be the general consensus from the wild edible community. And you want to toast them in the oven and then grind them up into a dark flour. And this flour actually tastes a lot like buckwheat flour, maybe a little bit more intense. They are in fact related. They're both in the buckwheat family. And you can add a little bit of this flour when you make crackers, breads, or pastas. I would probably not exceed about 1/4 of the total flour that you're using in the recipe, because this flour has zero sticking ability, like nothing. So it's whatever you're gonna make. If you make it like 100% or even 50%, it's gonna crumble. You wanna catch these before it starts getting too wet in the fall, as the rain can make the seeds mold and rot. So you want to look for when the seed heads start to turn like a brick reddish orange and they start to feel kind of dry and they easily pull off the stem.
There are two main species of dock to look for. They are broadleaf dock and narrowleaf dock, also known as yellow dock. And the narrowleaf dock is called that because the leaves are narrow and the broadleaf dock has broader leaves. They can be a little hard to distinguish the species when you're harvesting the seeds, but both seeds can be used equally.
Next, I want to get into harvesting leaves in the fall. And in general, it's like the evergreen plants that you want to harvest the leaves from in the fall. That said, there definitely are some like wild edible greens that you normally harvest in spring that sometimes have a second time in fall when the weather's just the right, like cold but not freezing, and there's a lot of moisture where the greens can kind of re-sprout and have some tender parts that we can eat. But in general, in the later fall, we're looking at mostly the evergreen things to harvest. The first major category is like conifer leaves, but usually we call them like needles or fronds if they're cedar. And specifically, I love harvesting true fir, and that Douglas fir is actually not a true fir technically. My favorite species is grand fir, which is Abies grandis, and it smells like Christmas trees because people usually do use grand fir trees as Christmas trees. So it has like this really lemony, sweet, aromatic scent, and that flavor translates into the things that you make from it as well. Now, if you are an experienced forager or even a beginner forager, you probably know about conifer tips, which we usually harvest in the spring around April or May. And those are like the really nice green tips that come out. But in the fall, we can still harvest the needles of these trees. Like, for example, windstorms often bring down a bunch of branches that we can then like grab and make into things. The thing that you should know about using needles rather than tips is that needles have more astringent compounds, and those astringent compounds, if you happen to extract it with whatever you're making from it, make it not taste very good. It like makes your mouth kind of dry, and sometimes they just taste really intense and acrid in a bad way. What you want is those like sweet aromatic compounds. So there are a couple of preparations that we can use just the needles of, and it does not extract that. So anything with alcohol is not what you want to make with conifer needles because alcohol extracts the astringent stuff really well. To some extent, water does too, like if you're making a tea. So what I like to make in the fall is anything that's like an infused honey. Honey doesn't extract astringent compounds well, but it does extract aromatic compounds really well. And then also we're looking at anything steam related. So steam also only extracts aromatic compounds. So a facial steam where you're putting needles in a pot and you put your face over it and you inhale the aromatic steam from it. But you can also make hydrosols, and hydrosols are something that normally people use these like fancy copper alembic stills that maybe you've seen me using on Instagram, but you also can just make one from a pot in your home. And there's actually instructions in my book in the wild carrot section about how to do that. And so you can make like grand fir hydrosol with needles harvested at any time of year, really. Pines and the spruces and the firs and everything in the pine family tends to have some common uses. One of which is that they are all really antimicrobial. They all also contain quite a bit of vitamin C, which remember is killed by heat. So if you want to extract that, you need to figure out how to get it out there, get it out of there without heat. And then another thing that they do is the aromatics, when they get in our lungs, they also help open and expectorate phlegm. So these are really great remedies for cold and flu season. I usually make syrups, oxymels, honeys, teas, all different things, facial steams like we talked about earlier. Those are all ways of using that plant during cold and flu season. You can use it kind of as a preventative, but you can also use it like if you have a cough, then you can make a fir honey and put it in your tea. Fall is also a great time to be harvesting medicinal barks, and by barks I mean both like shrub and tree bark, usually on like woody stems or woody trunks. There's a ton of different types of medicinal barks that are used for all kinds of different things, and which barks you're going to harvest is probably going to depend on what plants are growing in your area or what cultivated plants you have access to. So this time of year I'm harvesting Oregon grape bark. I love harvesting specifically tall Oregon grape stem bark. It's really great. It's a pretty sustainable harvest. There's a lot of it that grows in like landscaping around town, and sometimes I can even find some that people have trimmed off and I can just grab the material that was going to go to the yard waste bin. Oregon grape bark is one of our best antimicrobials of this bioregion. At some point, I'll do a whole video on Oregon grape bark. I promise, it's coming. With Oregon grape bark, you just want to keep in mind that it does look a lot like holly. So you want to make sure you're looking for the leaf pairs that are right next to each other in this pinnate leaf arrangement. It looks like it's opposite leaf arrangement, but it's actually called a pinnate leaf. And holly has alternate leaves going up the stems. Holly also has bright red berries, which persist into winter, whereas Oregon grape berries look kind of like blueberries in their color. They're blue with a little bit of yeasty sheen on the outside. And those berries kind of die off. They ripen in like July and August, and they die off and fall off the vine and are gone by the time you harvest the bark in the fall. In places outside of the Pacific Northwest, Oregon grape is actually a less common and sometimes rare species. So if you don't live in the Pacific Northwest, I don't recommend harvesting this bark, but you can definitely buy this bark from wildcrafters in the Pacific Northwest. It's quite abundant here and it's really easy to grow. Just a reminder that when you're foraging, to do it respectfully, especially when you're working with native plants and plants that might not be so common. You want to make sure that you're leaving enough for wildlife and that you're not depleting the population. Also, in the fall, we're going to be harvesting medicinal roots, and there are so many medicinal roots that I love to harvest. Some of the roots I like to harvest are dandelion root, mallow root, Solomon seal root, and yellow dock root, and these are all great things to harvest in the fall. I like to wait until the above ground parts of whatever plant it is are starting to die off a little bit, so around October or November, but before the soil is like frozen solid. So I would love to know what is on your fall foraging list, because I'm sure that you have a different list. And if you live in a different area and you have different medicinal barks or roots that you like to harvest, I would love to hear about those. I always get excited about different unique native plants in different parts of the country. I'm Natalie, and I make videos about plants, herbal medicine, wild edibles, and foraging. If you'd like to learn more with me, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I do have a book. I'll include a link in the comments, and I wanted to show you that I do have beautiful pictures. This is hawthorn, which we talked about in this video, and here's some pictures to help you identify both one-seed hawthorn, and then here in the Pacific Northwest we have a native hawthorn as well, and that's included.